Thank you, everyone, for being here. We are here today to announce bipartisan legislation to help protect voter privacy in the upcoming presidential nominating primary on March 3rd. Our proposal will do three big things. Number one, it will restrict sharing of voters' party preferences only to national party representatives, only for the narrow purposes set forth in the national party rules, and only for verifying primary participation. Number two, the bill will classify party preference information as private data under state law, which carries with it specific requirements for those receiving the information and consequences for disseminating the information to any third party. Third, the bill would create an opt-out system where voters can choose to be taken off the list that is to be shared with the political parties. I just want to zoom out for a minute and talk about how we got here. And there are others here who I think have a lot of personal experience on that front. In 2016, in my opinion anyway, the legislature made the right choice in moving from a caucus system to a primary system for choosing presidential nominees, opening the doors to hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans who otherwise wouldn't participate because they can't or don't have the luxury of participating in a 2 or 3 hour caucus on a cold Tuesday night. But the law does need to change. The national parties insisted in 2016 that their party rules required a closed primary that keeps track of who is a Democrat and who is a Republican. So voters on March 3rd or beforehand will have to choose a partisan ballot. Their choice of ballot will be made available to all 4 major political parties in Minnesota. That creates a backdoor party registration system, and we have never had anything like that in Minnesota. We don't register by party here. Most states do. We don't. And even worse, there are no limitations in the law whatsoever on what the political parties can do with that data. They could sell it, they could give it to a vendor, they could give it to a friend group, they could even post it online if they wanted to. So that needs to change as well, because that is just too big a risk for too many people, for small business owners, for journalists, for public employees of all kinds, for judges, for members of the clergy, or just for any Minnesotan who doesn't particularly care to wear their political affiliation on their sleeve in any way. So we're hearing loudly and clearly that people in Minnesota don't like that, and they don't want that. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can have a presidential nominating primary that doesn't force people to risk spreading their political affiliation. Minnesota, of course, is #1 in America for voter turnout, but I really fear that without a change in this law, we could see a dip in normally high turnout in this particular contest. Our legislation will sustain confidence in our election system and will shore up privacy for Minnesota voters. And there is plenty of time to do this. The deadline for getting a bill done is not March 3rd. The deadline for getting a bill done is the end of session, because it's 10 weeks after March 3rd that the counties have to aggregate and report all of this data. So there is plenty of time to get this done. We should do it, and the time is now to do it. With that, I'd like to hand it over first to Chair Ray Dean of the Elections Committee, who is the House author of the bill, and then to Senator Rest, who is the Senate author.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. This is something that, in 2016, I think there was some concern about having all this data available in a way that it could be possibly misused. I think this bill comes from a lot of reasons. I've had many, many constituents and people across the state of Minnesota contacting me and saying that you need to change this. I will not be voting in the presidential primary if my data is available to everybody. And then I've also had some people that have contacted me because of their rules of their faith that don't allow them to participate in a very political system. So I think these guardrails are really, really critical for the data. And I also think giving individuals the opportunity to opt out and having their name included in a mass data system that will actually be going to the party. So I think this is a great bill. It's bipartisan. I look forward to working with my colleagues so that we can get this done. I personally would like to see it done before March 3rd, because I think there are some people who might be reluctant to get out and vote prior to that date. So if there's a way possible that we could get it done, I think that would assist some individuals that are struggling with their decision to participate in the presidential and national primary. So if there's any way possible, and of course that will depend on my colleagues in the Senate as well, we will try to get this done by that time. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Senator Ann Rest.
Thank you, Ray.
Yep.
Good morning, everyone. I am so pleased that we are going to be able to offer a bipartisan, and I really want to emphasize that. If you notice from my press release, I have 2 Republican authors on the bill, as well as 3 Democrats. We are spread across the state. We have an inner suburban member who is an author, myself, a Minneapolis legislator, and a Western Minnesota legislator, Senator Eakin, and then among the Republicans, a far west suburb, Senator Housley, and then Senator Jensen from the Southwest Metro. And I want to emphasize that they reached out to me when they heard about this legislation. Senator Jensen in particular, reached out to the Secretary of State and then to me to ask to participate in this particular effort. I want to go back to something that the Secretary said, that going back to 2016, what had happened in 2016? Well, we had in our precinct caucuses, just like we had in 2008, we experienced a lot of chaos in both the Republicans and the Democrats, because we were now going to choose a brand new president. Barack Obama's terms had ended, and so there was great interest in both the Republican and the DFL parties in our nominating process. We, within 3 weeks of the 2016 caucuses, I had introduced a bill that mirrored in part the 1992 presidential primary that we had, a nominating primary that we had, and it started on its bipartisan journey through the House and the Senate. My House author at that time, the Republicans were in the majority, and a House Republican carried the bill, and it was passed and sent to the governor on the last night of session, setting us up for 2020. In 2019, we started really seriously changing the law to accommodate the legitimate concerns of those Democrats and Republicans in actions to protect their information. I believe that this bill that we have today does respect the practical rules of the national parties, and indeed honors the right to privacy of Minnesota voters, Democrats and Republicans. Some have asked about the opt-out provision, and we need to understand that we have that for regular elections. It's even has a title to it, the program. It's called Safe at Home, and it is available to those who, for whatever reasons, have legitimate fears or cautions about someone being able to get their address. For example, if you had an order for protection or something. So we need to honor that in this bill as well. So that's what that third paragraph in the bill language does. It mirrors the Safe at Home program for our regular elections, because the presidential nomination primary statute did not bring that in the past. So I'm very confident that Minnesotans across this state are going to ask all of us to understand how important it is for Minnesota Democrats and Republicans and anyone else who wants to join in selecting the nominee, that kind of participation to select arguably the most powerful leader in the world. And that's why when we originally had proposed this legislation in 2016, we wanted to make it possible to do so in a less than chaotic way, and to acknowledge that the state could join in a partnership with the national parties in recognizing how important this particular process was. So I'm hoping that we can move forward. The Secretary has indicated that we can pass the bill later. We don't have to pass it, even though Representative Dean wants to. I would too, before March 3rd. But the information does not need to be forwarded in terms of the roster information. We're going to do better than Iowa. We're not going to wait 24, 36 hours. We will have it just like we have the information for our elections now. We're going to have it. We're going to have it the night of March 3rd, aren't we?
Yes.
Yes. See, and I think that we can show that presidential nominations primaries, which I believe also are going to be the method of the future for other states that currently have other states that currently use precinct caucuses as well, and that Minnesota will stay in that column. So thank you for your interest, and I'd like to turn it over to Senator Abler.
Well, thanks to all three of you who spoke. I am pleased to be here supporting this effort. It may be I'm the only Republican up here, but if the data were available from the next election, you would actually know who is behind me and how many Republicans are up here, because I totally expect that information will become public. I imagine it's going to be leaked somewhere. It's going to go on a list, and who knows. Other people that are less worried about this think that's going to be secure. I am so uncomfortable with how secure that list would be. I believe it would at some point just become another mailing list on behalf of the parties. And so as I've been talking with my just local random people, you plan to vote on the primary election? Yeah, I think so. Do you know they're going to give you a choice of 2 ballots? They're going to keep track? What? This is, we think that, thanks for being here, media, but they don't always read your stuff. I don't know why, but they don't know. The average voter, at least in my district, does not know that they have to pick, and it's going to go on a list and go to somewhere. And when they hear that, they go like, what? How can that be? And there's a few people, as we mentioned, that have it tattooed on their arm what party they are. But the average individual that I've run into does not. They prefer the privacy. They like we do it. You can pick a column. In this case, you would pick the party of your choice and keep it a secret. And this is not a partisan matter in the least. I'm going to be carrying the clone of Senator Rest's bill. And I've not shopped this very heavily, but I already have one Republican co-author and then others. In 2016, when I brought the amendment forward to suppress this data, I had actually 9 current members of our caucus on there. The vote was 15 ayes and a few more nays, so it didn't pass. But this is a big deal, and I think it needs to get done before the election, because this is the chance to elect the most powerful person in the world, and people, we want to encourage that. That was the point of the primary system, and I'm going to do all I can to get this to become a law signed into by the governor before Election Day, so people can feel confident that Minnesota still, you can keep your preference to yourself. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is State Representative Kristen Bonner. I represent Maple Grove and Osseo. And I just wanted to add in, I come with a little bit of an interesting perspective on this particular issue. I am the vice chair for the Elections Committee, and I know that our chair has done a really good job of addressing some of these issues, and I'm really proud that this bill is coming forward. But I'm also a member of the Governor's Blue Ribbon Council on IT, and this particularly deals with data privacy. And when we talk about data privacy, not only do people want to know that their data is safe and secure, they want to know that we are doing all of the right things, but at the bottom basic level, this gets to the issue of trust. And I know that the Secretary of State has done an amazing job of continuing to put forward the idea that we need to collectively, as a body, ensure that the people of Minnesota, that they can trust in our election system, they can trust in our process, they can trust that it will be fair and equitable. And so I am really excited about this piece of legislation because I think that at its core, it does exactly that. It ensures that we can keep that data private and safe, and also ensure that we can trust in our election systems. So thank you for being here and raising awareness around this issue.
Hi, thank you for coming here. My name is Jim Carlson, and I'm on the State Government and Elections Committee. And what I'm very happy to portray is that this is not necessarily partisan. This is something that I have had people connect with me and say, I'm just not going to vote this year because I don't want my ballot choice to be known by the public. And I represent the cities of Burnsville and Eagan, and the council and mayors of both cities have been very clear that they don't want their election administrators to have to stay home or to not vote. They want their people to be able to keep their choice of ballot secret. We've had a long time attitude in Minnesota that we do keep our voting private. My personal anecdote is that I have a neighbor that the first time I went to his door and I asked him, we talked about issues, and I asked him if I could put a sign on his yard, and of course I could, and he has a real great location for a fence that is on a major street. And then I do what candidates do is I say, well, I hope I can count on your vote. And he corrected me, and he said, I never commit to whom I'm going to vote for. That's my decision, and it's my decision alone. So, no, you cannot count on my vote. That's the kind of attitude that we have had in Minnesota. People do not want to publicly commit to a party. And one of the things that I just learned this last weekend is in the 2nd Congressional District, where I'm a resident, the polls have said that people are responding, 49% are saying that they're an independent voter, which means if they want to remain known as an independent and not go to a caucus, they can't vote. And this is probably the lowest vote turnout that we in the legislature could ever initiate. So I'm so happy that the Secretary of State has listened to the voters. I'm so happy that the people that are up here have listened to the people that are saying that this is a problem. And we want to get this taken care of, and this is the year to do it. So thank you very much to the people behind me and to you for coming out.
All right, any questions?
No, this is a attempt to protect the privacy of the data, which presumably then means this would be an amendment to the Government Data Practices Act.
Yes.
Now, one of the experts in that field is Peggy Scott, who has alternative legislation that would just do away with this whole system. And her concern is that what this approach might do, and the Amazon case might suggest that she's right, is that once this data is out of the government's hands and handed over to a private entity, you have no control over it. So any law you pass will have no effect over that. So how do you respond to that criticism?
Two things. First, she's right that that's normally true, but what this bill would do is impose the same system we do elsewhere in state government, where those receiving the data would have to sign something, a contract binding them to Chapter 13, which is the Data Practices Act. So, right, normally when it leaves the government hands, she's right, and that's true. It loses its status. But the idea of this bill is to do, again, what has been done elsewhere. We're not recreating anything. There will be a contract. There will be a legal force to the fact that this is data. And let me just say a word to slightly hijack your question about that other proposal. You know, I applaud Representative Scott, Representative Garofalo, and others. I speak only for myself. I don't know if anyone else applauds them, but I do, for their proposal. The problem, as I see it, is that it would scuttle this primary. The national party rules, as far as we know, are pretty clear. You may like them, you may not, but they are requiring this so-called closed primary. To say that we're not going to produce the data at all would, in effect, have the state spend a lot of money for in essence, a null primary, one that the parties would not recognize. They wouldn't seat our delegates, either party, at the national convention. So while philosophically they're onto something, I don't think that's a practical solution right now, particularly because we're in the middle of it. We're in the middle of the absentee ballot period right now.
Do you believe that the Democratic Party would actually do that to Minnesota? I mean, Representative Garofalo said they're not going to do that, nor would the Republican Party tell Trump delegates you're not going to get seated. I mean,
Oh, I see. The idea that maybe they're just bluffing.
yeah, just call it bluff.
You know, that's pretty high risk, given the number, the amount of dollars that we're spending on this, and the time and attention, and voters' time and attention, and the fact that they've already started going to the polls. We've been releasing those numbers to all of you and to the public so far, so there's a steady and growing stream of people. So I certainly understand the appeal of calling the bluff of institutions who claim that their party rules require something, but I think that's an awfully big roll of the dice at this point when we're into the absentee ballot period. Yeah.
And again, I would emphasize and say again, the both interests can be met with the bill that we are proposing. We can respect the practical needs of the national parties, both Democrats and Republicans, and effectively, through this contract that Secretary Simon just mentioned, make sure, as much as we can in any kind of data privacy proposal, that voters will not have their information on the voter rolls that are available to all of us now, going back to 1998, I believe. That is commonly available to us. We know who voted and whether they voted in a primary or the general election. That information is public information. Obviously, we don't know who people voted for. We do know that in the precinct caucuses, at least in the Democrats we do. You have to go in, sign at a precinct caucus, sign a loyalty oath, you're given a ballot, you have to sign the ballot on the back, and the tellers know precisely who you chose. Now, we don't have that in the law even currently, but our proposal here goes that step farther, that recognizes legitimate, practical position of the national parties, both of them, and emphasizes that that interest is not going to trump, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use that word, but I sincerely mean it. It's not going to trump the right and the need and the desire of Minnesota voters to have their information private.
Mr. Secretary, have you consulted legal counsel at all about possibility of a challenge if a law like this were passed? Some will say changing the rules when the game is in progress. Now, I understand we're just absentee ballots,
Right.
but still, is there a chance of that? And have you assessed that at all?
You know, we have internal discussions. Naturally, I really am not in position to reveal those kinds of things, other than to say your question gives me an opportunity to address that argument out there. And you've heard some say that this is changing the rules in midstream. It isn't. It's changing what happens at the end of the stream. It's not changing anything about who's running the election, how the election is run, the equipment, the certification, the rules within the parties, anything. It's only changing in the aftermath of the election and what happens to the data.
Might the argument be made in court that, well, yes, none of those things are being changed. However, it's changing potential participants' perceptions. It may change turnout that would have not been there. And I understand the objective is to get more turnout, but that aside, that the whole dynamic potentially in some unforeseen ways being changed, and hence, Your Honor, this really ought not to be allowed. In a sense, it's an ex post facto or a change to the law.
I don't think that argument would be successful. Anyone's welcome to bring the argument up, but there's case law in Minnesota. I could name a few cases where courts are loath to intervene and guess what reality version 2.0 or 3.0 would have been had something been different. So I'm not so sure that that would be a successful argument, but anyone's welcome to make that argument, I suppose.
Are the parties on board with this opt-out?
feature?
So I would say this, we've been reaching out to both the RNC and the DNC, and our understanding and our hope is that the parties will be okay with this, with the opt-out. We'll have more to say about that as time goes on, but we have reached out to both national parties to try to determine whether this would in some way violate their rules. And right now, we have no reason to believe that it would violate their rules.
Because a lot of people opt out, the list loses its value at some point, I would think.
Well, so my understanding of both parties' rules is they refer to a word that I didn't even know about or had never heard before 2 years ago. They claim they have a recordation requirement, not records, recordation. A recordation requirement, and this probably meets that recordation requirement in both parties unless we hear otherwise. So we've been reaching out. We'll always hear their analysis, but no one has given us the red light.
Could someone sort of clarify the difference between the protections that were passed last year and what's changed with this proposal?
Well, we moved initially in 2019 to allow the information, or to specify that the information was going to be available to the respective parties. And then, when the legislation became part of the state government's bill, the final version of it was that the information was going to be made available to all four parties, major parties, irrespective of whether they had a national convention, and two of the parties have no national convention, but that the Democratic Party would have the Republican Party's list, all four parties would have the information, not just for the people who took their own party's ballot. I personally objected strongly to that result. I voted against the bill. I was the only Democrat that voted against the State Department's bill in the Senate for that very reason, because I saw what was going to be very problematic for a number of people. And so this bill corrects what I believe was a mistake in the 2019 legislation, and others weren't as, obviously, it passed with all but 2 votes in the Senate. Obviously, others were ready to accept that result. We now have the opportunity to have a much higher bar for the information, and I think it is the right thing to do.
Senator Russ, I'd like to just expand a little bit on what you said there. And that is a simple question: how did we get to this point? Was it politics that drove chambers against your counsel in this, or what happened? Because it seems like it would have been fairly obvious that some people might not have wanted their party preference to go wherever
it went. You know, there's a lot that happens in the last days of a session, and this bill, actually, the State Department's bill, was not passed during the regular session. It was brought up in the special session, and we often treat special session bills as if they're conference committee reports. So there was not the opportunity by a gentleperson's agreement to offer amendments that would have reflected my cautions. And I can understand, we had, it was a budget bill, and the governor certainly wanted to see the budget passed, and he, it was, and he signed the bill. But I think at every point, there's an opportunity to improve on statutes that have been passed. And I've already said on more than one occasion, I wish that we had anticipated this in the 2016 legislation. We were looking mostly back at, well, what worked in 1992? And that's what we were bringing forward with only modernizing language rather than the concept itself. I also like to tell people that in voting in the presidential nomination primary, it's like going to a giant statewide precinct caucus. That's what it's like. That's what this is, except it started January 17th and goes through March 3rd. You don't need a babysitter. You don't need to get off work, really. If you're out of town, you can vote at some other time. In the precinct caucus system for nominating a presidential candidate, you got to be there. You got to show up. And if you're not there, you don't get a vote or a voice at all. And that's why I believe that this system, and we can make it better, is the way for Minnesota to go, both now and in the future.
Can I just get a comment? A few of you have mentioned Iowa up there. Can we talk about, we're talking about Iowa, we've all been watching what's going on there. We're talking about privacy here, which is clearly very important to Minnesotans. Do these things potentially jade kind of the overall system, and can you still talk about that and the importance of involvement?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by the word jade in this particular instance. Do you mean
Impact people just from
in
getting involved?
a negative way?
Yes.
Well, we've heard from Iowa that the precinct caucus turnout that they had estimated was going to rival previous times, has not done that. People in Iowa, I don't know why, but the numbers in Iowa are down than the previous election cycle. There are a lot of people who don't go to precinct caucuses. There are a lot of people who are independents that say themselves, I don't want to participate in this process. I want to wait and see how good the choice is that the respective parties make, and then I will weigh in with my vote in November. But maybe the Secretary has further comment on that.
I do think people can become jaded or skeptical or worse when it comes to the caucus system for this particular contest. High volume, high interest, which is one of the reasons I think Senator Rest and her colleagues made the right decision in 2016 to make this move. I think it's fair to say people looking at what happened in Iowa, who are still looking at what happened in Iowa, are justified in their skepticism that maybe this is the best way to pick the most powerful person in the world. Again, a reason that the legislature did what it did in 2016.
Secretary Simon, it appears that the vote tally in Iowa leveled off the 2016 levels. Are you anticipating an increase in voter participation in this primary, or do you think that there may be sort of a curving effect?
Well, of course, this is, we haven't had anything like this. It's tough to know what to compare it to. We haven't had anything like this really since 1956. Senator Rest and others mentioned 1992, but that wasn't a binding primary, and that drove turnout down. This is binding, 1956, 64 years ago. So really hard to know what to compare it to. This is first of a kind in a couple of generations. So I'm not sure. I don't know what low would really mean, you know, seriously. I mean, looking around in other states, even in New Hampshire, some of you might know better than I, but even in New Hampshire, first in the nation primary, big spotlight, big intensity. I don't know whether they ever get over 30%, even in New Hampshire. So I'd have to check, but it's hard to know what high turnout means in this context. I think I can say, this is not an earth-shattering piece of punditry, but, you know, higher in the DFL party than the Republican Party, only because, not as a reflection of popular support, but because there's no drama in the Republican contest and there is in the DFL side.
So we are all out of time for today. Thank you so much for coming out. Got to wrap it up.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming.